So I've been talking about rulers in the last few videos, so it's about time we actually get our hands on one. So when we talk about rulers, you probably think about something like this. So this is where we'll start. This ruler here is 1 foot long. Some foot rulers are longer, but regardless, the foot is the basic unit of measurement. The foot, as I'm sure you all know, is further divided up into 12 inches. And since those 12 inches are equally sized pieces of the foot, we can talk about fractions. So if there's 12 inches in a foot, what fraction of a foot is 1 inch? So here's 1 inch. What fraction of this whole entire foot here is represented by that inch? Well, this is one piece out of 12, so that's 1/12 of a foot. Okay, so let's look at another interval here. So here is another fraction of a foot. How can we tell what fraction that is? Well, we don't know how many of those big intervals there are, but we can count and see there's 1, 2, 3 inches in that interval. So that's 3 pieces out of 12, or 3/12 of a foot. Okay, one more of these. So here's a great big one. And again, we can figure out what fraction of a foot this is by counting out how many of these pieces make it up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 6 pieces out of 12. So that's 6/12 of a foot. Okay, so that takes care of inches, but the real fun with fractions comes when you start talking about distances of less than 1 inch. So if you've ever looked closely at a ruler, you probably noticed all the little lines that are in between the inches. Well, often we need to measure things that are smaller than an inch or whose size doesn't exactly correspond with a whole inch. That's why the whole inches are divided into smaller intervals. Now, these smaller intervals don't have a separate name of their own, they're just referred to fractions of an inch. See, the inch is divided up into equal pieces, so we can use fractions to describe those equal pieces. So notice the lines that are dividing up the inches are different lengths. On traditional rulers like this one, each line length represents a different number of intervals. Here's what I mean. So clearly, the inch lines are the longest. You can see that these are the longest lines here. And those divide up the inches. The next longest lines are these lines in the middle between each one. And it's pretty easy to see with those that they divide each interval up into 2 pieces. And so when you get to this interval, that's 1/2 of an inch. So that next length line divides the inch into halves. So if we move over between 1 and 2 inches here, you see that these 2 lines here are the next line longest after this 1/2 inch here. So clearly, let's count here, 1, 2, 3, 4. That divides the inch up into 4 pieces, so each one of these must be 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch. And we see that as we count quarters, that this longer line is included in counting up those 1/4 inches. Okay, so moving right along, we see that the next longest lines are these here. You see I'm marking them over between 2 and 3 inches. And if we include the 1/4 and 1/2 inches that we've already marked, we see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 equal pieces. So each one of those lines there represents 1/8 of an inch. So as before, we include the 1/4 and 1/2 inch lines when we divide it up into 8 pieces. So each one of those represents 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so we look all the way over between 3 and 4 inches, and then there are some really small lines. The shortest, we see that those, if I sort of highlight those there, and then include with them all the other lines, this 1/8, quarters and halves that we already talked about, that if we count up these little tiny intervals here, we'll find that there's 16 of them. So each one of these the smallest interval on a traditional ruler is 1/16 of an inch. 1/16 of an inch. And we won't be using 1/16 of an inch a whole lot in fashion design, but they come in handy once in a while, so it's good to be aware of them. So let's do some measuring. Now, there's lots of little lines along the length of this shape here that we have up against our ruler. How do we know whether we're talking about quarters, halves, eighths, or 1/16? Well, this is where the length of the line comes in. So we look at the line that corresponds with the end of our shape, which is this line right here, and we see that this is an eighths line. So we're going to be counting out eighths. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. 5/8. So this shape is 5/8 of an inch wide. 5/8 of an inch. So here's another shape up against our ruler, and we see that the line that corresponds with the end of this shape is a 1/4 inch line. So we're going to be counting off quarters. So we have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. So this shape is 3/4 of an inch wide. Okay, here's another shape. This is a smaller shape than the other two, and this is the end of this shape here that we're measuring corresponds with one of the small little lines. So this is going to be 1/16 that we're counting here. That's the end of it matches up with the shortest of the lines. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This shape is 7/16 of an inch wide. So in some of the Khan Academy videos, they talked about fractions greater than 1. And what we have here is a shape that's longer than 1 inch long. So if we do this by counting off the fractions, we see that the end of it corresponds with 1/2 of an inch right here. So if we count off the halves, we see that we have 1/2, 2/2, and then 3/2. So it would not be wrong to say that this is 3/2 of an inch long. Now 3/2 is what's called an improper fraction because it's talking about a quantity that's greater than 1. Those are easily identifiable because the numerator is larger than the denominator. That's called an improper fraction. And when we talk about measurements, we usually use something called a mixed number to talk about the length. And here's how that works. First, we look to see how many whole inches are contained within this shape. And we can fit 1 whole inch in here, but we don't quite get up to 2. So this is 1 whole inch, and then this extra bit over here that's left over after we take out as many whole inches as we can, that is 1/2 of an inch. So this is 1 1/2 inches long. So sometimes you may need to make a measurement starting in the middle of the ruler. Now this is a little bit trickier. So here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to look at both ends of my shape and see which one matches up with a shorter line. So the left-hand side matches up to this line right here. That's a 1/2 inch line. This end over here corresponds with that line. That's a shorter line. That's a 1/4 of an inch line. So I'm going to count 1/4 inches then to find out the length of this shape. So I'll start at the left, and I see here that this is 1/4 of an inch, 2/4 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch. Now 4/4 of an inch, that makes up a whole entire inch. So I have 1 inch out of my way. So now I'm going to start adding quarters to that 1 inch to make a mixed number. So that's 1 inch. This is 1 1/4 inch. This is 1 2/4. This is 1 3/4. So this shape is 1 3/4 of an inch.